I'm going to move this way. Yeah. Hi, I'm Jon. I'm the narrative designer at Coatsink, and it is a pleasure to be here today. Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. Right, a couple of things before we start. Firstly, thanks for showing up. It wasn't so long ago I was sat in the front row at an event at Resd, kind of gazing up at the stage of people talking about storytelling, staring at them in a mixture of envy and lust. So thank you very much. This feels like a bit of a weird out-of-body experience for me. Second, apologies. First of all, if I'm based down and reading for most of this, there is a lot here and I haven't committed it all to memory. And finally, while I'm going to be talking a lot about writing Augmented Empire, I'll mainly be discussing the theory side and decisions made during development, so no spoilers for all people concerned there. Cool, right. So, and I'm also going to be bending down a lot to change the slides because I've just got words in front of me here. Cool, so what am I going to cover? Broken this down into 5 quick topics. What's Augmented Empire about? What was easy in VR, what was more challenging, the story itself, and writing dialogue. Parts 1 to 3 are relatively straightforward. Things get a bit more nebulous and theoretical around parts 4 and 5, so I might skip over a couple of bits there if we run along, which I'm sure we won't. Before we get started, has anyone had a chance to play the demo yet? I know you have. Quick show of hands. I won't pick on you, don't worry. Thank you very much. My next question, who came along because you're interested in storytelling particularly, rather than Augmented Empire? Hopefully more of you. That's great. I'm going to be talking about storytelling a hell of a lot, obviously, in and outside VR. So hopefully you should all get something out of this and just leave with a few new ideas to think about. Cool. Quick overview then. Augmented Empire is a VR action-adventure game in which the player guides a team of outcasts and misfits through a dystopian city of New Savannah, this is the title of the city, in order to overthrow the oppressive, controlling elite. The player sits in their secluded hideout and interacts with the team in a diorama-like version of the city, which is rendered on the table in front of them as augmented reality. This is a piece of old concept art. But anyone who's played the demo, sat in a chair, looking at the world, there's also things happening around you in first person. While most of the game is spent exploring with the team, investigating environments and fighting bad guys using a combination of turn-based strategy and skill, a significant portion of the game is spent in your room, this room, where you make calls, manage the team, and check out story developments. As for the characters, the player assumes the role of the enigmatic Craven, a criminal mastermind with a head for gadgets who instructs the team and makes the decisions. Next, there's Hartman, your robot associate, who speaks to the team on your behalf. Not pictured. He's incidentally voiced by Garrick Hagan from Star Wars. He played Biggs Darklighter, if anyone's kind of up on trivia. Then there's your squads. I'm not going to talk about those. If you've been following Coatsink online or played the demo, you should be familiar with a couple of faces. I don't have pictures, but yeah, if you check out Twitter or Facebook, all the information's there. Another shot from the demo here. The main themes of the game were solidified just before I came on board at Coatsink last July. Bioelectronic augments are prohibited by law. A citizen grade system separates the different tiers of the city, and you play as a criminal mastermind looking to take control. As for my role at Coatsink as narrative designer, it was my job to squeeze the most out of the drama and action from this core premise, to flesh out the world, devise the characters, and most importantly, find the story worth telling. So, what was easy? And I've just realized this is a completely unnecessary title page, so I'm just going to move on to the next one. Story treatments were drafted and redrafted the same I would for any narrative project, video game or otherwise. You start by figuring out, well, obviously we're all interested in storytelling. You figure out by figuring out the central conflict, the main characters, then structure everything into coherent plot beats. To illustrate this process, I'm going to present to you now some terrible artwork from MS Paint. So here we go. And it gets a lot worse. Augmented Empire is delineated into 3 acts, at least in my head. This is all kind of story structure 101, and if you don't already know this stuff, chances are you can intuit most of it by watching a marathon of Disney films. So these acts, yeah, starting at the top, just very quickly. Act 1, turning point, Act 2, major turning point, Act 3, resolution. These acts can be further divided into more specific beats. There's a variety of ways of doing this, but I like Christopher Vogler's terminology the best, so I'm going to completely steal it right now. Starting at the top and moving to the right and down, the 12 steps of Christopher Vogler's hero's journey go: ordinary world, call to adventure, refusal, meeting the mentor, crossing the first threshold. Can everyone read that? Do I have to read it? Yeah. Test allies and enemies, approach, ordeal/crisis, reward, road back, resurrection, elixir. I won't describe what they all mean because we don't have time, but it's just important to know that each step represents some form of dramatic reversal, and that the most significant moments take place generally towards the end of each act. And if we highlight those, we get something that looks like that. Crappy red circles. So at the end of Act 1, we see crossing the first threshold or entering the special worlds. Towards the end of Act 2, we see the ordeal or crisis, and then towards the end of Act 3, the resurrection, which is also known as the climax. Before writing Augmented Empire, we wanted to dedicate specific missions to these vital story beats, then lock them, sort of like the narrative pillars of the project. Because during development, things get cut. Inevitably, a feature here or a mission there, whether for time or budget or because someone important doesn't like them, it happens. And sometimes the thing that gets cut is the ending, which in my mind is like cutting off the punchline of a joke or the finish line of a race. But purely from a production standpoint, cutting the ending makes a sort of diabolical sense. If you build a game chronologically, the last thing to get made is often the first thing to be de-scoped. So at the start of Augmented Empire, I was desperate to mitigate against losing any part of the game that would impact the story in this way. So we decided that whatever happens, these are the sections that we do not lose. The rest of the missions are still obviously important, but without these specific 3 missions, the story simply doesn't work. And from that point, planning the game was straightforward. Inevitably, a couple of things got cut, a feature here or a mission there, but due to this initial process, we knew exactly what parts could be removed or reworked without affecting the sections that held together the core. That was the easy part. I'm actually going to skip over the rest of what was easy because it's not fascinating, although that picture of the genie kind of makes it look like it is. So I'm going to go on to the tough stuff. So what was challenging? Quick bit of game design theory here. The following paradox is one of my go-to reasons why video game stories are so difficult to write. I'm going to go into the depth a little bit later on with this idea, but for now, video games demand constant progress, triumph, and achievement. However, effective drama requires frequent setback and failure. Again, rubbish MS Paint artwork here, but it kind of makes the point. For example, if you played a game that followed the plot of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2 note for note, you'd constantly be getting your ass kicked and losing, which would create a very dissatisfying gameplay experience. Also, spoilers for a 13-year-old movie, I suppose. Similarly, if you watch the note-for-note non-interactive remake of Ocarina of Time, it would be about a kid who goes out to collect 3 gems, then does, then a teenager who goes out to collect 6 medallions, then does. Again, spoilers. You do get the medallions. Both are obviously superb examples of their medium, but it's important to remember that the hero's progression in drama doesn't translate to a satisfying interactive experience, nor does the player's progression in gameplay translate to a satisfying dramatic experience. Because in games, the central form of engagement is interactivity, overcoming challenge. But in traditional, more linear story, the central form of engagement is the very question of the hero's success. And this is vital. Because success is, in a sense, guaranteed in story-driven games. You win when you get to the end or see all the content. It's the how that we come to these stories for, or come to games more specifically. Point being, you can't have a story in which the challenges are constantly overcome while simultaneously creating doubt that the hero won't ultimately win. The solution we found for Augmented Empire was to create a story about a plan gone wrong, then leave the player character gathering the pieces, trying to make do with what they've got. This changed the missions from being a heavily prescribed to-do list of areas to liberate or gangs to overthrow to something a bit more freeform, with each mission informing the next as the player hurtles from one crisis to another. The result, as it was commented during development, is a story that feels very ad hoc, has a very kind of on-the-fly vibe, like you're making up the plans as you go. And I can't stress how different this is to making stuff up as you go when writing. I think we went through about 10 different drafts of like 100-word plot synopsis alone before we were happy with what the story was and for it to take this kind of freeform effect. So, what else was more difficult? Number 2, the player's point of view of the action. This one's kind of a given to anyone who's played the demo. And this is a screenshot from it. So obviously it's a small window here, but if you played the demo, you'll recognize Ashley and Archie at the back. He's on the floor, she's kicking him in a friendly way. I can't stress how friendly that kick is. This locked point of view was a blessing and a curse. On the plus side, the player isn't constantly required to be aware of all directions at once, which keeps the action nice and contained. However, the angle and distance risk detaching the player from the characters, all the way at the back there. In fact, almost like they were playing a video game. This made important story sequences tricky. Due to the distance, subtle animations are out. We couldn't, for instance, convey an important plot point with a steely look, through no lack of trying on my part. Generally, third-person cutscenes in other titles allow the camera to do a lot of the heavy lifting. You create an entire story beat just by cutting to the right camera, character at the right time. But in VR, we obviously don't have that luxury. Instead, the design team had to find creative ways to have all the physical players, the characters, coalesce at key moments without it looking unnatural or forced. Number 3. Finding reasons for the player to interact with their environment outside the artificial reality gameplay, augmented reality gameplay rather, was another fun one. On one hand, we've got this whole space to play with, but the player can't move. And we can't have them manipulating the environment like it's Esper or Esper 2, and that is indeed a shameless plug for other games that we're demoing today. Do check them out. A number of cool things happen in the player's immediate space in the room, which I won't go into, but I can mention a small handful of things. Hartman's always present to relay information and do cool stuff. If a few people that I've chatted to, Hartman is a character that floats around and speaks to you throughout the whole game. Certain objects in the immediate vicinity are interactive and come in very useful. The room improves as the game progresses, meaning this immediate environment changes. The room looks very, very different at the end of the game as it does at the start, as you progress through the game. And there are ways to review story events and learn more about the world. Finally, we're going to come on to the really tricky part now. One of the largest problems faced was the disconnect between what the player knows and what the player character knows. This concept isn't even slightly new to video games. In fact, the solutions that developers have found to address the problem are cliches in and of themselves, such as, well, that worked nicely, didn't it? Amnesia. These are the only words as well that I put this fancy kind of PowerPoint presentation stuff on. They're supposed to animate in all kind of badly, but yeah. Anyway, with Amnesia, we can throw the player right into the middle of things at the start, but it's okay if you're confused because you know exactly as much as the character you're playing. Not to labour the point, but the horror title Amnesia is obviously a very good example. Alternatively, flashbacks. Oh, that one was pretty. We can start in high action, then simply flash back and do all the explaining. I'm sure you can think of your own instances of flashbacks. My go-to is that Rick and Morty episode where Morty has to listen to the lighthouse keeper's tale. This is not her day, Fate's Black title, 3 weeks earlier. Yeah, flashbacks are very self-explanatory, but used purely as a tool for expositions, they tend to irk me, simply because a flashback is not the ongoing action, and players and audiences want to know what happens next, not yesterday or 10 years ago. They want to know what happens next. So finally, my favourite one, expository dialogue. Why not put all your exposition in the mouths of your characters? This is the #1 cause of unnatural sounding chit-chats. When characters deliver information they both already know simply for the benefit of the player, which can look a little like, "Hey little brother, wow it's sure hot here in Somerset, not like my place in Edinburgh. Don't forget it's Mum's 50th birthday tomorrow. By the way, how are you getting to a party at the restaurant?" So just very, very long expository text. And just an ABC answer. I'm going by bus. I'm going by car. Or we've been stranded on this mountain for 2 months. Knock off the crazy or I'll eat you. This is obviously just some nonsense that I made up, but it's designed to make the point that if you can figure out the story from the dialogue alone, then what you have is a radio play, not a video game. A further alternative is to have it not matter what the player character knows. But what's the point in becoming someone specific if who they are and their motivations are irrelevant? So if we don't use the cliches, what's left? We're still left with the problem of needing to convey a lot of information very quickly to the player. Or are we? Does the player really need to know everyone's motives and histories before we can start exploring and shooting things? I would argue not immediately. It needs addressing, but we've obviously got the rest of the game to do all this kind of explaining and world building. Naturally, though, the player will have questions, and in Augmented Empire, the first question will likely be the same question you have playing the demo, which is, who is Ashley? When we meet her at the start of the game, the player character, this character called Craven, who's in this environment, sat down looking at the table, knows the answer, but the player has nothing to go on. So to explain, the player is encouraged to glean the nature of their relationship with Ashley through how they interact, the two of them, through their tone and familiarity, the in-jokes and politics. In other words, to work it out for themselves. To quote Andrew Stanton from Pixar, the audience wants to work for its meal. It's the well-organized absence of information that draws us in. He calls this the unifying theory of 2 + 2, give them the puzzle. Generally, players don't want to be told things regarding story. They want to work them out. They just don't want to know that they're doing it. Again, I'm completely ripping off Andrew for this one. However, this player/player character disconnect becomes more complex with the issue of motivation. We can't see inside Craven's head. And at no point are Craven's motivations explicitly stated. So, we come to part 4, the story itself. Right, I'm going to explain in depth how a specific interactive element of the story in Augmented Empire functions now. It's kind of involved, and I'm going to charge through it at a bit of a furious pace here, so hold your breath. To start simply, characterization, which Robert McKee describes as, here we go, the sum of all observable qualities of a human. This is simple enough. It's their appearance, age, gender, politics, hair color, etc. However, true character is revealed in the choices that they make under pressure. And this is what we see during the story. And I don't mean Augmented Empire, the story, I mean any story. In any story, it's revealed in the choices they make. So that pressure is vital. If the character has nothing to lose, then the choices they make are meaningless. Therefore, the phrase character-driven story is redundant. All stories are character-driven to some degree. And to summarize this, the story is formed by the choices made by a character when something is at stake. It sounds simple enough when you kind of put it in a pithy heading and highlight some words, but we all know there's a lot more to stories than that. So what about this business of the character arc? So, excuse me whilst I just take a swig. In very brief terms, a character doesn't win because they are good, or lose because they are evil. Rather, success is based on their ability to change, and I'm coming back to McKee for this one. The story arcs or changes a character's inner nature over the course of the telling. By the climax of the story, these changes have profoundly affected the humanity of the character. But why is this change even important? Why is it necessary to have a character arc? I'm completely plagiarizing myself for this one, but the answer is in another much broader question, and that question is, why do we enjoy stories at all? Why do they inspire us? Not to sound mawkish, but it's because we all struggle. We all want to be good people, to fit in, be loved, and be successful, and we all fall short to some degree. Stories show us a vision of how we might become those people through struggle and virtue, and by overcoming our lesser qualities. And again, this is something I wrote a few years ago, but internal conflicts are universal. We face them every day. Seeing our heroes overcome this part of themselves shows us that we too are capable of overcoming adversity. Again, characters don't win because they're necessarily good, but because they show the capacity to change. Of course, not all stories rather end happily, which brings us hurtling onto the nature of tragedy. The inability to change invites tragedy. These are very quick slides. in which the unchanging character is punished by failure, defeat, or death. And on that deeper level, this still affirms a core belief that unless we are capable of changing ourselves, we will struggle and fail and perish. And I'm going to pause for breath here because that was an awful lot. And obviously it's not all specific to VR, but... these really are the cliff notes as well, I should probably point out. Far smarter people than me have dedicated their entire lives to this subject, and I'm really heavily summarizing here. But right now, if you cast your mind back to what I said earlier about the problem of constant achievement and progress in games, you might see a problem, as I did. In a game, if all you do is win, move on to the next level, then win and move on to the next level, in what sense do you or the character you're playing change? Okay, so you're learning skills and growing and leveling, but by change I mean questioning that deeper part of their character, their core values. What fundamental aspect of that character arcs through this experience? So, constant progress invites tragedy, or at the very least an unsatisfying story experience in which the function of story itself is not wholly realized. Without experiencing setback to no defeat, game characters can never experience internal conflict and change in this way. So what can we do? It might seem a bit tangential. I'm going to leap back onto Augmented Empire right now. What follows is a blow-by-blow breakdown of how Augmented Empire attempts to address this problem. And this is in a 4-part solution very quickly then. Step 1, we introduce a binary moral choice, honesty or kindness. Binary moral choice, your mind might leap to, oh, so you get to be good or bad throughout this game. That is not the case. In Augmented Empire, we ask the player to choose between 2 seemingly benevolent actions, honesty or kindness. Being honest often means stating the cold facts, but while honesty is generally perceived as a good thing, it can also seem cold and uncaring, like a machine reeling off statistics. Like, for instance, a character asks you, Craven, am I going to die? And if you say yes, because it's the honest one, you kind of seem like a bastard. The alternative to honesty is friendship, bothering to take the edge off an unpleasant situation, perhaps even deceiving someone to spare their feelings. So again, coming back to that example, am I going to die? No, of course not. Everything's wonderful. Much friendlier example, you're not exactly being honest there, though. In practice, this forms decisions such as the following. This is one of the first in the game. Craven, she's not safe, she needs to move. Answer 1, be kind, we need her to trust us. Here we're being kind, but also kind of manipulative for our own ends. We want her to trust us, even though we're not necessarily trustworthy. Or answer 2, be curt, if she doesn't move, she's dead. Here we're stating cold and frightening facts, perhaps even being aggressive, but in the interest of saving her life in the second one. Time and time again, we ask the player this question: do you want to be kind or do you want to be cold? Do you lie or are you mean? Then once the player's found their groove and picked a side, generally kind of erring on the side of kindness next to honesty, we tell them to stop doing it. We tell them to change. And if they do, that's a step towards the character arc, and if they don't, then the player's on the path to tragedy. Finally, and very simply, we use this process to determine the story. I've kind of skipped over the actual nuts and bolts of that, but this is the general idea behind it. And so to summarize, in a very cool and pithy phrase, in Augmented Empire, the player character's true nature, their motives, and eventual actions depend on this arc that the player creates. And I've rattled through an awful lot there, and as a reward, I'm going to move on to a more practical fun part for the end. How are we doing for time, by the way? Has anyone got a watch? Perfect, thank you. You're correct. Cool. All right. So the first thing you should know, I tend to regard dialogue how a baker probably regards whipped cream. It's a finishing touch, and one that I'd rather not use, and it creates that all-important first impression. It's what everyone sees right out of the gate, and it has the potential to make an otherwise delicious cake look crap. Second, I have a philosophy about chunks of text in general in games, including dialogue. And it goes. Text should take less time to read than to decide whether or not to read it. In practice, this simply means no huge blocks of text. 10 to 15 words at once is fine, or a couple of short sentences. I'm going to digress twice now. In VR, yeah, you're just painfully aware of the fact that you have the player's undivided attention, and you don't want just reams and reams of text staring at them explaining loads of things. So, which is why I've just kind of developed these ideas over the last like 9 months writing a VR game specifically. I'm also going to kind of soapbox for a moment. Hold on. There we go. And again, a bit of a digression into exposition here. There's a whole debate whether to be had or whether or not vast swathes of text in video games are benign at best or harmful at worst. So I'll just speak from my own experience, and that is that I'm incredibly impatient. I don't come to video games to generally read large blocks of text because we have books for that, or to be stuck absorbing backstory that I don't necessarily care about because we have UE Bowl for that, which is the smartest joke in this entire speech. So, thank you very much. So, for example, when I chat to a non-player character, for instance, I want to infer a bit about their character, but only hear the stuff that's directly applicable to what I'm doing. And there's plenty of NPCs in Augmented Empire that you interact with, but you don't get this long diatribe about just what they were doing 10 minutes ago and what they had for lunch yesterday. In life, when you ask someone in the street the way to the bank, you don't want to hear about their hip operation. So as a general rule of thumb, and as I'm sure we all know, gameplay is king, not the story. And you can extrapolate this to the whole narrative, in fact. Before you give us a character's backstory or a huge chunk of lore about the world, first make us care about them. Otherwise, just make that information optional, because while backstory is obviously important, it's a very long way from being necessary. Okay, right, back to dialogue specifically now. What makes good dialogue? First of all, that's a really silly question. The answer varies massively depending on variables I can't actually begin to list here, but in very, very broad strokes now. When it provides the maximum information in the shortest space. Information here doesn't necessarily mean facts. It doesn't mean distilling phrases down to hard numbers or names or whatever. Instead, information is anything that progresses the story, reveals character, or informs the player. Ideally, all three at once. I won't break these down now. They're self-explanatory. Secondarily, good dialogue only supplements its context. It does not create it. Context is essentially everything surrounding the dialogue, because the reason why something is said is every bit as vital as to what is being said. It's the situation and continuing action. And the best dialogue, on top of everything else, contradicts this context. These are the lines that we remember the most. I'm going to quote a couple of movies here, so forgive me. Say hello to my little friend. This doesn't work if Tony Montana is introducing his girlfriend Elvira to his new puppy. Get away from her, you bitch. Doesn't work if Ripley's talking to Newt's PE teacher instead of a monster the size of an aircraft. And Royale with cheese doesn't work without. So if you're writing dialogue for its own sake, devoid of any context, then it's probably, by this definition, not good dialogue. I'm going to give an example from Augmented Empire now. And it's an important line from Hartman, and it goes a little bit like this. No. This is used a few times in the game. It's a fairly popular word. But yeah, the context here. In one specific context, the word no tells the player that a character's lying and that they're trying to coerce someone. It means that Hartman, in this case, is desperate to gain this character's trust, that they're grudgingly creating a problem that they know could seriously bite them in the ass later on. However, in a different context, Hartman saying the word no means I don't agree with you, but I trust you, and we're together to the end. And I doubt any of this makes any sense. In fact, it shouldn't make sense because it's missing all the context. And finally, just like whipped cream, the very best dialogue is the kind that's kept in the fridge, unused. So when writing your own, as I imagine a lot of you hopefully do, examine every conversation and ask yourself, what is the point of this? Who wants what in this scene? Why is it interesting? And how does it move the story? Then finally ask yourself, can this plot point be conveyed in a different way with fewer words and less dialogue, perhaps even without any whipped cream at all? Because like storytelling itself, dialogue is necessarily temporal. It takes time to convey an idea this way, and that's time that the player needs to spend concentrating instead of losing themselves in your awesome game. And now, closing statements. Quick recap. Hopefully by now you have an idea of what Augmented Empire is about, the easy things and difficulties developing a story for VR, and the ways we overcame some of the problems. And perhaps you have some small insight as to why video game stories are so difficult to nail. Yeah, okay, that's me. Thank you very much for listening so quietly and patiently. I'll sit back down.